Our good dead friend, Rene Descartes. Little background for him. He was born March 31st in 1596 in what was then known as La Haye, France, now apparently named Descartes. Interestingly enough, there's also a La Boissière, France. I've never been there. One assumes that it was named after me. No, one assumes that I was named after it. Getting back to Descartes. Descartes received a scholastic education at the Jesuit College of Les Fléchés, which I'm probably horribly pronouncing, because although I have a French last name, I am completely American. He earned a degree in law, and as one does, he joined armies to see the world, meet interesting people, and presumably kill them. On November 10th, 1619, he was shut in for the winter. Back then, people sensibly generally stopped killing each other in the winter because it was cold and the powder would get wet, etc. And while shut in, he had 3 vivid dreams. And in these dreams, he was given, or so he believed, a mission from God to solve the mysteries of philosophy using mathematical reasoning. Because, what is more exciting than solving mysteries with math? In gratitude for these dreams, he vowed to make a pilgrimage to the Italian shrine of Our Lady of Loreto. In 1649, he got what he thought was his dream job. Back in those days, kind of the dream of many philosophers was to become essentially a court philosopher, that you would get hired on by a king, a queen, a noble, or someone with lots of money, and, they would get the appearance of being wise and learning, and the philosopher, of course, would get, money and stuff. So in 1649, he thought he got his dream job. He became the tutor of Queen Christina of Sweden. This, unfortunately, was a bad choice, because it killed him. Apparently, the cold of Sweden, and she was one of those people who liked to get up super early. So his meetings with her were at 5 a.m., and he caught pneumonia and died on February 11th, 1650, and is, of course, still dead today. Which teaches one of the most important lessons of philosophy, which is this, or rather 2. Don't live someplace that's too cold, and don't get up too early, or you will die. So what did Descartes do pre-death? Well, he wrote a lot of stuff. He was quite the writer. In 1620, he wrote The Rules for the Direction of the Mind, which was published after his death. In 1633, he wrote Le Monde, translated as The World. It was a work on physics. The world is matter in motion. Now, this didn't get published until 1664 because our good dead friend Galileo had been condemned by Rome for a similar view, and Descartes decided, he'd rather not get in trouble, or more trouble. In 1637, he wrote and published The Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting One's Reason and Seeking the Truth in the Sciences, which is written in French rather than Latin. As you might imagine, the title was shortened down to Discourse on the Method, and shortened even more down to the Discourse. Probably because when people went to booksellers and said, I would like the Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting One's Reason and Seeking the Truth in the Sciences. A lot to say. So, Discourse. In 1641, he published his philosophical tour de force, his claim to fame, the Meditations on First Philosophy. In 1644, he published Principles of Philosophy, which he modestly hoped would replace the textbooks that were based on Aristotle that were used in universities. And then in 1649, he published Passions of the Soul. And these are all still in print. Of course, he doesn't get any money for it because he's super dead and they're all public domain now, but still in print, so good. So what was he up to? What was his motivation? Well, like many thinkers during the time period Descartes was Descarting, people like Hobbes and Locke and so forth, and even our good dead friend Leibniz, he was motivated by dissatisfaction. The philosophy and science of his time, although, doing philosophy and science stuff, he thought there were problems with it. To quote him, translated of course, he says that philosophy, to quote, has been cultivated for many centuries by the most excellent minds, yet there is still no point in it which is not disputed and hence doubtful. And this is a common charge against philosophy to this day, that everything is disputed and doubtful, which leads to the misconception that philosophy is all just opinion, and the misconception that philosophy makes no progress. Although some could argue counter that philosophy is just opinion, and that explains why it doesn't progress. Now, his main worry was about science. Why? Well, as he noted, despite what scientists say, science, the foundation of science is philosophical assumptions. I mean, to use the most obvious example, if you're going to do physics and you're going to say that there's physical stuff, there's matter, you have to assume, no matter how much one might wave their hands or dance around it or hem and haw and cough, you got to assume that there is metaphysically a physical universe, that there is in fact matter. Now, of course, a physicist could say, I'm not going to engage with any philosophical discussions about matter. It's just obvious there's matter. Well, that's still a philosophical position, that the world is composed of matter. And if you're going to use mathematics to do sciencey stuff, that rests on the philosophical assumption that math is a thing and that math works. So the sciences, although they obviously claim to be, these solid things that require none of that philosophy crap, they are founded on philosophy, because the basic principles they have to accept, like if you're a physicalist, you have to accept that there's matter, which is a philosophical position. And if you're going to accept, logic and math, you've got to accept those philosophical assumptions that logic and math actually work. Now, Descartes was honest about this. He, being a philosopher and a scientist, he recognized that science is built on the foundations of philosophy. And he recognized this is a serious problem, because if you're building your supposedly solid sciences that are all concrete and stuff, and none of that silly philosophy stuff, on the silly philosophy stuff, they're gonna be shaky if the foundations are shaky. And his view was that the philosophical assumptions were shaky, that they were unreliable and doubted, and could be doubted. So that was his motivation. Everything is uncertain, and he wants to save the day for science. Now, he traveled quite a bit, both physically and mentally. One thing that was kind of a hallmark of Descartes, and also the modern era, was a revolution against the dogma of the day. He was tired of the fact that the teachers, teaching, in the universities, simply repeated the old ideas of Aristotle and scholastic dogma, and he decided to rebel against that. And it's something that happens in all academic fields, even supposedly rebellious philosophy. One day you're the young cool rebels, like you're Aristotle, being all rebellious against Plato, or you're Socrates, being all rebellious against the pre-Socratics. And then the next day you're the establishment, and then the cool kids are rebelling against you. And so Descartes was the cool kid rebelling against the dogma, and now, perhaps ironically, he is the dogma that philosophers who teach intro to philosophy classes just, repeat his stuff dogmatically. So he set out on an intellectual journey, and to see, all these ideas. And like the sophists before him, his exposure to this vast diversity in opinion made him, more confused and gave him more doubt. But unlike the sophists, he didn't say, skepticism, success matters, blah, blah, blah. He took a different path. So Descartes takes an inward focus. He decided to undertake studies within himself and use all the powers of his mind in choosing the paths he should follow. And his goal was this. He wanted to locate, find a solid foundation for the sciences. Again, because one of his motivations was the foundations of science were all, broken and terrible. And he believed that once you build that solid foundation, you can build a solid structure upon it. Now, some consider him the father of modern philosophy. Why? Well, a large part because of his approach and style. He wrote in an autobiographical manner, talking about himself, and a very individualistic approach to philosophy. Now, unlike medieval philosophers, he rarely used quotes and generally didn't rely on arguments from authority. Now, interestingly enough, if you happen to decide to pursue, say, a PhD in philosophy, unless things have radically changed since I was a grad student, what you'll tend to do in your dissertation is spend a lot of time looking up quotes from philosophers, talking about them, and probably saying a lot of stuff about what they said. So philosophy is settled down pretty hard into dogmatism again. Although there are people doing some radical stuff, a lot of it is just pure dogmatism, which always happens. So Descartes, back then, was operating as a solitary thinker. He saw himself working towards the truth, which on one hand is, kind of interesting and cool, but also, of course, could be seen as being like a conspiracy theorist. Someone, you can picture someone in their basement or attic with one of those boards with all the threads connecting everything together. Now, one thing that you can do in philosophy to this day, thanks to Descartes, is when you write a philosophy paper, you can use personal pronouns. You can say, I think, I believe that, in my opinion. And Descartes' the guy that made that, in many ways possible. Now, he believed that individuals have the intellectual capabilities to discover truth on their own. So, as opposed to the idea that, one works within the system and goes along with the authority and tradition and so forth, his view is that any of us could take an individual journey to the truth. Now, he's not a relativist, though, or a subjectivist, because he did believe that although all these journeys are individual, they all would lead to the same truths, or so he claimed. So what were his goals? Well, I've suggested at least one of them. One was to find certainty. Why? Well, I mentioned how the foundations of science, the philosophical assumptions were cracked and broken and weak. And his view was that doubts and conflicting opinions were what were cracking the foundations of science. So, how do we solve this? Well, his view is that we need to find this absolute certainty. If you have absolute certainty, that would be a foundation that would be unbreakable. Then you can build science on it. So it's all about the science. Once you get the foundations in place, he wanted to create a universal science, which would consist of a unified set of principles from which you can deduce all answers to all scientific questions. Now, depending on who you talk to in the sciences, you are likely to get them to make this claim that there is sort of an ultimate end game of a universal science that answers all the questions. And as you might imagine, people tend to think, their field will take care of that. Typically, the people in physics talk about it the most, though. That they can handle everything, it's just all variations of physics. He also wanted to, as his third goal, to reconcile the scientific, mechanistic conception of the universe, because during the time period Descartes was Descarting, this is also the rise of what we'd recognize as, science, current, contemporary, science in the modern sense. Not just like modern, like that time period, but modern in like now. And so the best science of his time, of course, was mechanistic. But he also wanted to have human freedom, and of course, he was a devout Catholic, so religion as well. And this is something people who believe in, freedom and or religion, but also believe in science, struggle with. How do you reconcile what science tells us about the universe with the notion of freedom and the notions of religion? And so what Descartes struggled with, still a struggle for some thinkers today. So how is he going to make this all happen? Well, His method, which was extremely popular back when Descartes was Descarting among the thinkers, was of course mathematics, because everyone loves mathematics. Now Descartes, of course, was the guy who does, the math stuff, geometry. You've probably heard of, the Cartesian coordinate system, geometry, and the Cartesian thing is, well, Descartes. I guess they didn't want to call it Descartesian because that would be slightly harder to say. So knowing a lot about mathematics, he decided to use math as a model in his quest for certainty and universal science. Why? Well, most thinkers regard math as absolutely certain and self-evident. So what better thing to use than something that is supposedly absolutely certain and self-evident? And he also believed that you could apply it to everything, which is still a popular conception in the sciences today, that everything can be mathed. He expressed this view in his work, The Discourse, and he claimed that his method of mathematics had two mental operations, intuition and deduction, which, if you recall back to our good dead friend Plato and his line, those are, in the line. At the highest level is the intuition, and then the level beneath that would be the methodology of what we'd call today deduction. So how do these work? Well, first, intuition. Intuition for Descartes is the recognition of self-evident truths. And metaphorically, you could say that when you see them, you see the light of truth shining upon them. And Descartes talked a lot about the natural light. Not the beer, but the other natural light, which is essentially was stolen from, St. Augustine, who stole it from Plato, who probably stole it from somebody else. So what are these self-evident truths? Well, Descartes initially, although he comes to doubt this, regarded the truths of math and the principles of logic as self-evident. So the way they work is this. If your thinking is working properly, and you examine a self-evident truth and you understand it, you will simply see the truth. It will show itself to you. These self-evident truths are not derived from other truths, and they're not proven by other truths. They're just true, and again, when you understand them, you'll see the truth. Now, he and other thinkers didn't claim that everyone automatically knows all these truths, because they can be quite complicated, but his idea is that if you do understand them, you would see the truth. So where did they come from? Well, his answer was this. They're innate, because Descartes is a rationalist, not surprisingly. And so he believes we have these innate ideas, and where'd they come from? Well, since he's a devout Catholic, not surprisingly, God. He does accept that we're not always aware of these ideas. And one debate that occurs in philosophy, also psychology, is how aware are you of your own ideas? Now, being a good rationalist, he believes that you can't get these ideas, these self-evident truths, from sense experience. And the way you discover them is, as I alluded to, is by this special intellectual vision. And this, of course, goes back to Plato and Augustine and others, and is kind of a stock feature of rationalism. If you're a rationalist, again, you believe that there are a priori truths that you can know about the world, you probably believe in innate ideas, and you probably believe in some sort of, intellectual vision that just shows you the truth. And it's a nice metaphor, but the standard sort of criticism or question is, how does that even work? And no one's really given a great answer to that. So the first method is intuition. You just see the truth, like a light bulb going off. The second is, of course, deduction. And this is when you make an inference from propositions that are either known from, with certainty already, or have been established by a necessary inference. Going back to argument basics, deduction is deductive logic. If you have a valid deductive argument, true premise going in to a valid argument, give you a true conclusion. So what you would do is this. You'd start off with self-evident truth or truths. Use them as premises in a valid deductive argument, and then you would know, because if you know the premises are true because they're self-evident, and you know the argument is a valid deductive argument, it would be sound, which would mean they would have automatically a true conclusion. So this ties us back to argument basics and deduction. Now, he really liked this method, and he seemed to believe that you could get to all truths by applying this method of deduction. Now, this is not surprising that he accepted this, because he was the first person to publish the Principles of Analytical Geometry, which was published in 1637. And the idea was that you could take spatial figures, triangles, etc., and analyze them in terms of numbers and variables. And this is really important, because part of it is that you can take the physical world and translate it through geometry into mathematical forms. To give a concrete use of this, think about, I'll give one very practical and one fun. The very practical one is essentially engineering, because you can transform physical objects into mathematical forms, geometric forms, and design things, buildings, jet engines, etc. And also the fun part is that's how video games work. When they create the visual images, they are, if it's three-dimensional game, 3D, they're mathematical constructs. And so without Descartes developing this notion, someone else probably would have done it eventually, but this notion of converting the physical world into mathematical forms was a very important contribution by Descartes. Now, he also believed this method could be applied to everything, to all knowledge. And other thinkers during this time had the same sort of great, hope that you could do this, like a Leibniz, for example. You'd be able to come up with this perfect method and solve all problems. Now, as I mentioned, his philosophical tour de force is the Meditations on First Philosophy. It has 6 meditations, and it's written as if he wrote them over the course of 6 days. But it actually, he wrote them over the course of about 10 years. Why the 6 meditations? Well, the most common and fairly plausible explanation is that the Jesuits, who educated Descartes, would spend 6 days of the Holy Week studying the spiritual meditations of Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the order. So that's probably why. So that's the background from our good dead friend Rene Descartes. And next we'll head to Descartes' first meditation.